Hello everyone, this is Jerry. I'm a 37-year-old autistic adult, and today I'm once again going to court controversy. This time by talking about something I briefly touched upon in another video, and that's autism self-diagnosis. When I first heard about this phenomenon years ago in my early 20s, I dismissed it as a mild annoyance. I shook my head and just thought that the best thing to do was to simply pretend these people didn't exist, because I thought, well, nobody's going to take them seriously. They're just doing it for attention, so why give them the attention they so desperately crave? Why let them do their grift? So unfortunately, this trend's become more prevalent since then, and it's not just autism that's being self-diagnosed, it's also other forms of neurodivergence such as, OCD and ADHD as well, which I find also rather troubling, but I'm focusing primarily on autism for this video, both because it's the most common form of self-diagnosis, in large part due to the fact that it's a spectrum being used rather conveniently by the self-diagnosers, and it's the particular form of neurodivergence I am most familiar with, given that I actually have it. Now, quite frankly, it's gotten to the point where it has become a serious problem that is doing a substantial amount of damage to the autism community and threatens to reverse much of the progress I have seen and tried to influence myself for the last few decades or so. Now, this is part of a much larger trend that's especially apparent among teenagers and young adults, where they feel the need to identify as something that's different than the norm. As I've said before, it's a new form of conformity which masks itself as nonconformity. An episode of South Park that aired almost 20 years ago really made this point quite well. In this episode, Stan gets depressed and upset because his girlfriend Wendy broke up with him. His friend Kyle tries a bit of tough love with him, saying, in so many words, he understands he's hurting, but, he needs to move on and stop moping all the time. When he doesn't do that, he says to him, well, you might as well join the goth kids, which he does. The goth kids, for those of you who don't know, don't watch South Park, are these kids that are part of the goth fad that was prevalent at the time when they were introduced. In other words, they dress in all black and talk about how life supposedly sucks all the time. They're, in a nutshell, they're black pillars with fancy costumes. That's pretty much what they are. Now, there's a running joke throughout the South Park series that the goth kids pride themselves on being so non-conformist, unlike all the quote-unquote Britney and Justin wannabes, as they described others in one episode, but that they themselves are often the biggest conformists of all. When Stan joins the goth kids, he does so because it's not because it's who he really is, but because he's emotionally vulnerable after a devastating breakup and wants acceptance and support. Instead of getting this from the goth kids, he gets peer pressured into being someone he's not. We can clearly see this in one clip that I have linked in the description, where they do a poetry reading and they reject Stan's poem as ungoth because Stan mentions in his poem how he misses his girlfriend and wishes they were still together. Now, as we can see from another clip, again linked in the description, that they exert this pressure on each other as well, as the de facto leader of the goth kids agreed to join Stan's dance troupe in another episode because he's supposedly such a nonconformist that he will not even conform to the other goth kids. Even though he kind of thinks the whole thing is lame. Go figure. Now, when I was growing up in the 90s and even into most of the 2000s, normality was valued by society as a social good and divergence was bad. Now, this cultural attitude reinforced a lot of discrimination I and many others, seen as different, have gone through and was the wrong attitude to have. Now, though, it seems like there's a massive overcorrection where instead of normality being a public good, being seen as different for the sake of different is now seen as a public good by many. Now, this has caused many to adopt identities that are contrary to who they are and in many cases outright absurd, as I brought up in my video about autistic children being taken advantage of by bad actors within the LGBT community, which you can also see linked in the description of this video. So if you don't hate me already, you might hate me for that one. But then again, I've seen what makes those people cheer, so their boos just don't affect me. Identity crises, or rather phases, have always been common among the young and have in most cases been harmless precisely because society did not indulge in them, and most people eventually grew out of it. Now we have a litany of mostly young people trivializing neurological conditions like autism that affect millions of people simply because they want to feel special and important, or worse yet, because they want to grift for the clicks. Wanting to be accepted, to have an answer to the nagging question we all have in the back of our minds as we grow into adulthood of who am I is understandable. Going through phases is also understandable. But that it's becoming increasingly clear to me that the profound damage that's being done by society by validating this, while it is true that not everyone is diagnosed early like myself, many autistic people go undiagnosed, and diagnosis is out of reach for many. Autism self-diagnosis is not valid because being autistic is something you can't identify as. It's not a hat you can take on and off. It's just something you either are or you're not. I understand and am okay with someone saying they suspect they might be autistic but have difficulty getting an assessment. But I'm not in favor of self-diagnosis because once again I have to emphasize that it's not something you can identify as. It's something you are or you're not. Now, yes, having a form of neurodivergence that's going to affect your sense of self and your identity, I acknowledge that freely. As, differences in the brain are going to have an effect on practically everything. But again, do I need to repeat myself further? Well, nearly everyone's heard of autism. There's still a lot of misconceptions about it, and there are many of us in the autism community doing our best to try to address these misconceptions, and this trend really is just not helping anything at all. I'm willing to entertain the possibility that some of these people might actually be autistic, but in addition to the peer pressure aspect of this, and this maybe a bit of social contagion as well, there's also a far more sinister aspect of this larger trend where people just try to do this to make themselves perpetual victims, which again is part of an even larger, just even more annoying trend. It's the hip new thing now to not be privileged, so to speak. The worst aspects of the far left have unfortunately normalized identity politics, which has given ample opportunities for many grifters, which is exactly what most of the more prominent members of the self-diagnosed crowd are. Discrimination is still a huge problem for many autistic people, and once the general public finds out that this self-diagnosed trend is so common, it's going to make a lot of this discrimination even worse. The reason why is because many autistic people, including me, are able to pass because we engage in a practice called masking, which in and of itself deserves its own video. I could make several videos on that topic alone, but to make a long story short, it's a practice where someone will hide aspects of their true selves to blend in with mainstream society. It's something everyone does, regardless of whether they're neurodivergent or neurotypical, so to speak, but because of the way our brains work, autistic people have to do this to a far greater extent than most other people do. The general public is not going to react well to this again once they find out about it, and it's very likely they eventually will. Some of the far left might, but even though they're loud and incredibly annoying, they only represent a small portion of the population, albeit one with a lot of political, cultural, and institutional influences, but that pendulum is already starting to swing, and it might not end very well for a lot of these people. So, that's a topic for another day, though, so to speak. But this could result in many autistic people who are legitimately diagnosed, like myself. I was diagnosed at age 2, but can pass getting discriminated against because people think we're faking it. Now, I've seen many self-diagnosers justify this by arguing that a diagnosis is a privilege, like it's some kind of golden ticket or something. And I'm here to tell you that that claim is so far divorced from reality that I don't know what to say about it. A diagnosis can be helpful in getting supports and accommodations, and multiple studies have confirmed an earlier diagnosis is more likely to have better outcomes due to being able to get help sooner, but privilege implies a lack of struggle, and I'm here to tell you that a lack of struggle is not the reality even most early diagnosed autistics like myself have faced. Now, they'll also argue that it's expensive to get an official diagnosis, and they're unfortunately correct, but this fact is not a justification for self-diagnosis, but is an argument for improving the broken mental health care system. Now, in some cases, you can get evaluations for free. I don't know terribly too much about that. I've heard that from someone another autistic person I know on Twitter. But if cost is a concern for you, that's certainly something to look into if you're trying to get an evaluation but are having trouble due to expense. But that was the whole point behind my last videos. Even though I did use an extreme case of someone who is, as he put it, famous on the internet as an example to prove my point, I do admit that this is a problem, but seriously suggesting self-diagnosis as a solution is like saying we should use gasoline to put out a fire. It's not going to work. Lastly, but not most ridiculously, they'll also say that getting a diagnosis could somehow backfire. They could result in them facing discrimination. Legally speaking, many supports require an official diagnosis. Most accommodations in educational and workplace settings require an official diagnosis. Granted, I've said before, an official diagnosis doesn't mean you won't face discrimination, but in addition to people being more likely to believe you with an official diagnosis, there are certain legal protections you're likely to have with one that you basically don't have without one. Some of them will go as far as to argue you'll lose a significant amount of your legal rights with an official diagnosis, and I'm not familiar with the laws of other countries, but I know that may have been the case 50 years ago in America, but it's really not the case, there today. I've been around the block a few times. I can honestly tell you, even with the steps backward I mentioned in recent videos, things I've gotten far better since my own diagnosis in 1988, and I want things to continue to get better, but this trend is simply not going to do that. To me, it's just another step backwards, and it's one that needs to be nipped into the bud as soon as possible.